In the corporate world, titles come and go. You can be a CEO one day, a consultant the next. They're all temporary. But what if a label, once you got it, was stuck to you forever? Today, we're diving into a uniquely Indian corporate idea, the promoter, and how this permanent label created a real identity crisis.
Just imagine this for a second. You start a company, pour your heart and soul into it, decades go by, you hand over the reins to a professional team, and now you only own a tiny fraction of the shares. But in the eyes of the law, you're still seen as the one pulling the strings, with all the heavy responsibilities that come with it. This wasn't hypothetical. It was the reality for so many people in India.
So, let's get right to it. What in the world is a promoter? The definition is actually way broader than you might think, and it's the absolute key to understanding this whole mess.
Okay, so a promoter isn't just the person who founded the company. According to India's securities regulator, SEBI, there are a few ways you can get this title. 1, you're in control of the company. 2, you were instrumental in actually forming it. Or 3, and this is the tricky one, you were simply named as a promoter in an official document, like an IPO filing. As you can see, these things can overlap, and that's how that label gets so sticky.
And right there, that's the trap. Because you could be named in a document years ago, the regulations basically created a situation of once a promoter, always a promoter. There was just no official process, no clear path for someone to shed that title, even if their actual connection to the company had totally changed.
Now, this wasn't just some theoretical problem buried in a rule book. This permanent promoter thing created some very real and very human dilemmas.
At this point, you're probably asking, okay, so what's the big deal? It's just a label, right? Well, it turns out it's a huge deal when life happens and business evolves, but the rules stay frozen in time. Let's look at a real-world case, one that SEBI itself highlighted. You had two family members, let's call them A and B, who built companies together. They had a falling out and signed a formal agreement to split everything up. A wanted to stop being called a promoter in B's companies, and B wanted the same. But under the old rules, nope, they were stuck with the label.
Or how about this situation? The daughter of a company's promoter marries into a family that runs a direct competitor. I mean, talk about a conflict of interest. She wants to do the right thing and get reclassified as just a regular public shareholder to make a clean break. But again, the system just had no answer for her.
And then there's this really common scenario. A family starts a business, they grow it, and then they decide it's time to bring in professional managers to take it to the next level. They might only keep a small percentage of shares with no special powers at all, but that promoter label kept them legally tied to the day-to-day operations.
So with all these very real problems piling up, it was obvious something had to give. And that's when the Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, stepped in. They decided to create a new framework, basically building some clear escape routes for people who are promoters in name only.
SEBI came up with 3 specific pathways out. The first is if another company takes over. Makes sense, right? The second is for situations like that family dispute we talked about, if you have a formal separation agreement. And the third path is when a promoter's ownership stake simply drops below a tiny 5% threshold. But, and this is a big but, this wasn't about creating a bunch of loopholes. These escape routes came with some very strict guardrails to protect investors and to make sure that anyone exiting was truly giving up all of their influence. Yeah, to get reclassified, you had to play by a very clear set of rules. As you can see here, you had to give up any special rights, you couldn't hold any top management jobs, and you couldn't have any control over the company, period. In short, you had to become just like every other public shareholder.
And really important here, this wasn't some snap-your-fingers kind of change. The whole process was designed to be slow, deliberate, and totally transparent.
In fact, when you think about what happens after this reclassification, there's one key number you've got to remember. And that number is 3.
Here's what it means. For 3 whole years after someone is reclassified, their shares don't count towards the company's minimum public shareholding requirement. Now, this is a really clever safeguard to stop companies from using this new rule to just barely meet regulatory requirements.
Okay, so let's zoom out. Why does all of this matter? I mean, it sounds like a pretty technical regulatory tweak, doesn't it? Well, it's actually a massive shift for corporate India. So why is this so important? Well, for companies, it just allows for much smoother succession planning and ownership changes. For founders, it finally gives them a clear and dignified way to step back. For investors, it creates much-needed clarity on who is really in the driver's seat.
And for the Indian market as a whole, it just modernizes the rules to match the reality of how business actually works today.
You know, this entire story really boils down to one fundamental challenge that every regulator on the planet faces. How do you balance having strict rules with the constantly changing needs of business? It's this perpetual balancing act, creating rules that protect the entire system, but are also flexible enough to allow for growth, for change, and for the messy, unpredictable course of human lives.